Welcome back, everyone. This is Chase, and joining me today, Chuck Kennedy and Denice Hermann, founders of DownHome. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for taking some time. It's great to see you. First of all, we're doing this in the midst of everything happening with COVID. So how are you two both doing in the midst of everything that's going on right now in the world? Are you doing well?
Well, we live 50 miles from town, and so life isn't really all that much different for us because we don't see people in town anyway. We have fewer trips. We miss our faith community, I guess.
Yeah, we miss going to mass. Other than that, things are the same. We try to be careful with neighbors and family, and because we're not young, but we've had huge food co-op orders, and yeah.
Well, I'm glad that you're both healthy. Glad that you guys are staying safe in the middle of everything that's going on. You're in Southern Oregon, is that right?
No, we're about midway up. We're between
midway.
Eugene and Florence in the coastal mountains.
Okay, I guess I'm confusing the history a little bit because you lived kind of Southern Oregon, right? At one point.
Arcata. We lived in Arcata.
Right, Arcata, and then moved to where you're at now.
Yeah, we've been here for 40 years.
Okay. Well, we'll get into the history and set the record straight. So, well, I wanted to have you on because we, I talked about this with you a little bit before we started recording, but we've been doing these conversations, oral histories with people like Bruce Johnson, historians of the outdoor industry, and DownHome is one of the companies that he loves, and he loves the story of the Arcata region. We had an episode all about the different hotspots around the country for gear making. And he wanted to do a whole episode on Arcata and what is it about that region that there were companies popping up and people making products, and DownHome was one of those. And so I thought it would be great to get the creators, the founders, on to tell your story a little bit. So
how many minutes do you have?
Oh, you know what? I've got a lot of time. I'm good until.
Okay, here we go.
I've got plenty of time.
Here's the story.
Yeah, no worries about that.
Our version of the story.
Well, maybe we can go back a little bit and I'd love to hear, where did both of you grow up? How much was the outdoors a part of growing up for you, and how much did that influence you wanting to get in and make products yourselves?
Well, I grew up in Southern California, and did a lot of camping. I mean, it started with Boy Scouts and stuff. Mm-hmm. But when I went to Pasadena City College, there was a club there called the Highlanders, and it was a hiking and mountaineering club, and it was actually the first time I really felt like I fit in to something. And then in 1967, I moved up to Humboldt State College in Arcata. And we had a club there. It's called Boot and Blister. And it was the same kind of thing. I don't know, to catch Denice up, why don't you say how you got it?
Well, I was a Navy child, born in Virginia. Moved around a lot. Our family was a fair number of kids, so we didn't go to any foreign countries or anything, but we moved around a fair amount. And we did some camping. My parents would take us camping, but I was in Girl Scouts for a bit, but that's kind of it. Just kind of a worker bee. We joined forces, and I helped make it happen.
Yeah. So how did you two meet in Arcata? Or did you meet there?
He had a backpacking, bicycling, river touring store. At that time, I was working at the theaters in Arcata, and a friend of mine that worked there also said they were looking for somebody to sew at his shop where they made equipment before DownHome. This is before DownHome. And I was looking for more work, and I went in there and applied for the sewing job to make sleepy mags and whatever.
I had told the worker that I had was really good, and I told her anybody that she recommended I'd hire.
Yeah, so I got the job.
That's a pretty good interview process.
Denice came in, and the other part of it, she came in.
This is over 40 years ago.
And I looked at her and I thought, I think I'm in love.
That was that.
But
I got hired.
yeah, and so really, I guess leading up to that is the history of the Arcata stuff. But which with the Boot and Blister, I was the president of that club for a couple of years, and in that time, in '69. I was involved with the conservation movement there, and in '69 we began preparing for the first Earth Day, and I became the chairman of the committee that was organizing stuff basically for Northwestern California, the North Coast, and we had a really large, we had a whole week-long program that ended up in a fair with that. Anyway, I spoke at the high school, Arcata High, about this, and I was recycling my truck and bought a really, really nice bike to replace it. And so at this assembly, I said, well, instead of trying to have the hottest car in town, you might think about having the hottest bicycle in town. And I said, over there in the corner is the hottest bicycle in Humboldt County. And anyway, after the thing, a couple of guys came up, and one of them said, well, where do you buy a bike like that? And I said, well, Berkeley or San Francisco, which was 300 miles away. Another guy said, well, I have a bike like that, and where do you get parts for something like that? And I said, well, Berkeley or San Francisco. And I had gone, at that time, in Boot and Blister, I had gone around to the sporting goods stores and just basically begged them if they would sell something like water bottles or anything that had to do with backpacking. And they kind of went, huh? And so, and same with bicycles. I went to, at the Schwinn dealer, went to get a derailleur cable, and I said, to what? And and so I came back from this assembly to our office, and I was really frustrated. I said, how can we ask people to do this when they can't even get anything like this within 300 miles? And this other friend said, well, geez, it sounds like we need to start that general store we've always talked about where it has stuff like this. And so that was where the idea came. We didn't have much money. Steve O'Meara and I started, I think our total investment was $1,200, and we had a dozen water bottles stretched out on a shelf to try and make things sort of look, all our bike parts were in two small paper bags. And that's how it started in 1970, and it grew.
And the name was?
It was the Arcata Transit Authority, specialists in human-powered land transport was that, and it was around that. It was around human-powered stuff was the idea. Well, there was I met it was through Sierra Designs that I heard about it, but a guy down in Santa Cruz named Dave Meeks. He was a Yosemite climber and was making custom sleeping bags in Santa Cruz. And he agreed to make 5 bags a month for us. But he got tired of that after a year or so, a couple of years, and said, well, you guys ought to start making them yourselves. And so we got another couple of friends to kind of get into that. And they called their stuff Blue Puma. And there was the Presbyterian minister in town was making Frostline kits, and stuff. And so they got some ideas from that. Then they decided to quit that after a couple of years, and we took it over, and I became the manager of that part. And at that point, I started really rethinking things, and we totally redid the sleeping bag design and the clothing designs and stuff. Then in it was late 77, we were having a meeting, and talking about expansion and stuff, and I realized I was describing what probably should happen. And then as I was talking, I realized that I didn't really want to have anything to do with it. Everything was kind of turning into adult fashion boutique stores rather than hardcore equipment. And so I sold out. And Denice had been working there for some months before that. And I wanted to become a farmer, go out and I'd always felt like when I was going to the mountains, I felt like I was going home. And I was thinking, well, if that's where home is, why am I here? So I wanted to move out. We don't have any land. We don't have anything. What are we going to do to support ourselves? And I thought, well, I know how to make sleeping bags. And I just redesigned the stuff there. But one of my frustrations in doing stuff was get told, well, we can't do that because this is the way people have always done it, or that's too expensive, or whatever. And so when we started, we spent an entire year rethinking sleeping bag design. We didn't sell anything for a year. And I was trying to change all the stuff that I thought could be changed. And so that's where our designs came from. Fred Williams had started Moonstone Mountaineering in the meantime there, and we became friends. And so I'd make a prototype, and then we'd bicycle over to his house, which was out a ways from town. And he'd look and he'd say, oh, that's great, you know how to do it. And I said, well, it's not quite right. And so we'd go back and make another one and make another one. And it took a year till we came up with the bag that we wanted to make. And one had a floating hood for being able to sleep on your stomach or whatever, and the other, but
a stomach sleeper. Of course.
And another thing was that you have the differential cut. The theory was so you can't push through the stuff, but with a single zipper, you could push through it anyway. So I wanted to do double zipper. The only person at that time was Jack Stevenson, making the warm light bags. And I actually called him and asked permission to use his idea.
The double zipper.
The double zipper.
Well, we had a whole interview with Bruce about Jack Stevenson, and it seemed like he was never too concerned about keeping his ideas, just his ideas. It seemed like a lot of people were willing to reach out to him and, use those ideas or talk to him. At least you asked permission. It seemed like a lot of people didn't even ask permission. So that's great.
Well, we ended up having a good long distance friendship going on with it. And, but with his double zipper, it still didn't address this issue of differential cut. And anyway, the way we designed it, it became a true differential cut. And so that was one of the things we changed. The other, the baffle design, you have sewn through, you have box construction, you have the V-tube construction. But with the box construction, they could collapse. I mean, just like a rectangle, it can collapse over, and which kind of defeated that thing. And so, and the V was too tight. I mean, it was only for really, really thick sleeping bags. So I came up with what it called trapezoidal baffling, which was taking the V and spreading it out. And then that spacing of the baffle changed depending on the thickness. And so it became proportional to the thickness of the loft of the bag. And then up in the upper body, Marmot was doing a collar inside the bag and stuff to deal with the closure up there. We started doing was actually a mummy shape, literally, where it came up and it curved in over top of the ship, really followed the body contour. And with the hood also all of the thing was differentially cut where the entire bag was full thickness insulation all the way around. And so those things, plus the idea of, well, being able to roll over in the thing was the other part. And so the floating hood looked like a space helmet or something. And so we had the attached hood and we had the boxed hood, I mean the different floating hood. And then the sewing, this is where Denice became an essential part of it. I could dream up these things, but the part of the sewing was also, I mean, this guy, you know, just the quality of the stuff. I didn't want any sewn seams, you know, where you couldn't really figure out where the heck the down came into the bag. But in there, up in the hood area in particular, things were so tight. I mean, you were having to get into tiny baffles through other tiny baffles. And so I'd get it to where I figured out that it was theoretically possible. And then Denice had to do it. And her sewing was incredible. We had one guy, Lonnie Thomas, who he made all of his own equipment. He was a physicist down in Berkeley, but he was an incredible perfectionist. He made all his stuff except his sleeping bag. And we met his criterion for it. And it was, I mean, Denice's sewing was incredible.
Well, the nicest compliment was we had a customer from Chicago. He said, I grew up in a tailoring family, and you do really, really nice work. I said, oh, thank you. We tried.
Wow. Yeah, that's a huge compliment. When was all of this happening? 77?
Well,
78?
So we started DownHome in 78.
Okay.
We started selling bags in 79.
Okay.
The Arcata Transit Authority started in 1970. So that was, as far as the start in Arcata, it started with Arcata Transit Authority.
Right.
The store opened in 1970?
Yeah. And so I was...
And equipment.
And that was something where we went down to Berkeley. In trying to look at things, we went down to Berkeley and we went to Sierra Designs, to their retail store, was asking for help. And the manager, and I can't recall his name, but the manager said, you expect me to sit here and tell you what I've learned in 30 years of this? It was probably 20 years anyway. He'd been going a lot of years, and you want me to just turn this stuff over to you? And well, yeah.
Yeah.
His ideas?
Yeah, and where you get it, your sources, all that type of thing.
Right.
And so we got talking. We just talked, and he says, after a while, he says, "Oh, here," and he opens up his file cabinet, and he does literally give us everything, all his sources, all his, and it was an incredible gift. And then. My bike I'd bought from Velosport in Berkeley. It turns out when I went in there, the owner of that, Peter Rich, my first 10-speed was in 1962 when I was going to Berkeley, and I bought it at Berkeley Cycle and Toy shop. And it turned out that Peter was the high school teenager that put my bike together then. Anyway, so we got to talking to him, and he said, well, I wouldn't start a bike shop if I didn't have at least $10,000. And I said, well, we only have $1,500 at that point, and we wanted to start a bicycle and a backpacking shop together. And he said, well, I wouldn't do it without experience. And I said, well, unless you have a job for me this summer, anyway, and he just on the spur of the moment, he said, okay, you can have a job here. And I said, well, we're going on this trip. I can't get here for a couple of weeks. And we finished the thing. And then I bicycled from Arcata down to Berkeley summer. Well, on that trip, down in Los Angeles, we hooked up with a couple of suppliers in the backpacking. We went to Raleigh, a distributor, to go there, and he said, "Oh, we wouldn't take on anybody without at least a $40,000 investment," which took care of that for us. But anyway, you're yakking. I've kind of forgot where I was going. But anyway, that's how Arcata Transit started. And then at that point, we had support from the guys in Boot and Blister, basically. One guy wanted freeze-dried foods, and I didn't really, I believed in just buying stuff from the grocery store. I thought that all this freeze-dried stuff was a ripoff as far as money, but he really wanted this. And so he gave us the money to get a stock of this stuff. He said, "You can just pay me back in food." And, it was that kind of support from people, because there was nothing there in Arcata at all. Fred, when he moved there, he started the Moonstone, again, just really small. And then by the time we started DownHome, we rented a place in an old industrial building, and Fred ended up, he was wanting to expand. He ended up renting space right next to us, and our offices were connected. There's a wall between them, and we would go back and forth, and we'd be talking about all these design stuff. And to where his wife, Nikki, for Christmas, gave Fred and me an intercom, which was 2 tin cans with a string going between the wall. So all this is very sophisticated. Then I think on our last conversation, you asked where the name came from with the DownHome.
Yeah.
And that was Fred and I I went with Fred down to San Francisco because he had to get all his Polar Guard insulation from down there and then drive it back because the distance and stuff, the shipping was really expensive. So we were on the way down there, and I was talking about these dreams about this shop that I want to start. And well, it was going to be basically the cash crop that could allow us to move out to a farm or something. And I thought, well, and we can maybe raise some geese and, for our own down. And I said, well, it'd be kind of a down-home operation. And Fred said, that sounds like a name for it. I thought, oh, yeah. So we pulled off the road at a payphone, and I called back to Denise and asked her, well, what would you think about us calling it DownHome? She said, well, whatever.
That's fine. Sounds good.
So by the time we got to San Francisco, I was introducing our company as DownHome. And so anyway, all this kind of stuff back then was, if you thought about it at the time, it was almost like all these things started as a joke almost.
Yeah.
But we designed the stuff, and then Fred, who had gotten into wholesaling and stuff, and he was a really
he was a better business person,
hyper guy who was really doing this business stuff, and he was really pushing our stuff, and he's the one that connected us with Wayne Gregory at Gregory Mountain Products, and Marmot. At that time, Marmot was the real premier brand, and they had a shop in Berkeley. We were down there, and Fred became our sales representative essentially, and he took stuff. Well, I had done the stuff sack that I designed for the bags because I was concerned with that. It was a double layer stuff sack with a fancy closure on the top. It was kind of like a package closure on it.
Have you ever seen one of those?
Anyway,
No.
anyway, so we opened Wayne Gregory down there. At that time, he had a little tiny shop along with his backpack. And we took him on as a dealer. Marmot took us on as their custom line of bags. They sold above their own bags. And then there was Guinea skis in Jackson, and there was mountain something in Boulder. I've forgotten now. And so we had those for a number of years, and then our bags got so expensive that we decided that we couldn't. They were priced. Our top bag was like $800, and so we ended up cutting off the wholesale and just doing stuff direct. But our bags, like that bag had over $200 in wholesale materials in it. I mean, because we wanted to. My goal was to make the best bags in the world.
To last.
And to last. And so we got down that was above the quality of anybody was getting. We were paying $50 a pound for the down. Anyway, so yeah, that's how it got going. Shortly after at Arcata Transit, I started when Nordic skiing started to become introduced into this country. Nobody knew how to do it up in the North Coast, and so we started a Nordic skiing school also to go with that. And then we got into whitewater rafting and kayaking, and so these are all my dream things. Anyway, we started a whitewater touring company, Six Rivers Whitewater, and Don Banducci and Steve Cole and I started that. And after a while, Don and Steve was a mechanical engineer. He was one of my partners in Arcata Transit, but he was a mechanical engineer also. Anyway, Steve went up. There was a guy up in Yakima, Washington, that built the best foot braces for kayaks. And he was an old guy and he was retiring. And Don didn't want to see this stop happening. So they went up there and talked him into selling Yakima to them. And at that time, it was just foot braces. Then you had a really funky car top rack. And they took that, and with Steve's engineering background and stuff, and Don was a real salesman, they started Yakima rooftop racks. And so we had Arcata Transit. We had at that time, the bags that we made at Arcata Transit were called Blue Puma. Because Don Leach's wife, Kathy, in Girl Scouts, had something called the Blue Puma, and so they had a blue Volkswagen that they named the Blue Puma. So anyway, that's where their name came from. And then Puma Shoes threatened to sue us for copyright infringement, I guess, on the Puma name. And so they ended up changing. After we sold out, they started making dry suits for kayaking and for diving and stuff. They kind of originated dry suits, and they named their company Kokatat. And so Kokatat dry suits started. And so Arcata Transit, Moonstone Mountaineering, DownHome, Yakima Rooftop Racks, and Kokatat all started in Arcata. And so when you ask about where all this stuff from Arcata started,
with you two.
With Earth Day in 1970.
Yeah. I think that's why I think I was interested in this story. I think it just goes to show that, how much two people can have an influence over, I don't know, so many different things, right? Yeah, I mean, you can trace back so many companies. I didn't know about Yakima and the connection there. I mean, you can trace so much back to this region.
The Jerry's, Ed. The really big one, Eddie Bauer. all those things started again with just people, you know, who are backpackers or whatever, starting Sierra Designs, North Face. I forget which way it went, but North Face kind of came out of, one of them came out of the other, really. And these came out of Trailwise, I think was the name, in Berkeley. And those are the three in Berkeley. They all kind of start, again, out of just individual backpackers or climbers starting this stuff. Chenard started in Patagonia. Chenard started with, he and Royal Robbins were big rock climbers in Yosemite, and Yvon Chenard knew some blacksmithing, and he had a portable forge and was making pitons there in the valley for the climber, you know, to climb with. And again, it's just individuals, and Royal Robbins started his store. All of these things grew out of just individuals who were really committed to their sport or to their activity.
Right. I think it's also interesting. I mean, I think there's a common thread too. It's between a lot of you just figuring it out, right? Figuring out how to do it. There wasn't a blueprint for how to do these things.
Yeah.
Did you have anyone that you looked to, or companies that inspired you, or?
Dave Meeks, Meeks, down in Santa Cruz, was making his bags. He was a Yosemite climber also, but he was making bags, and then he wanted us to start making our own bags.
His wife was Elaine Meeks.
Yeah.
Alayne, Elaine Meeks.
Yeah.
In Santa Cruz.
And then he quit it. And by the time before we got to DownHome, he had dropped out of making bags to become a beekeeper. And again, it was this idea, it was kind of the same reason I dropped out, to hope to become a farmer. But so he was one person I really looked up to. And this thing about copying people and all the confessions, true confessions, at Blue Puma, again, this idea of where to close the bag, where to put do the fill from. North Face they closed their bags inside. I thought was really interesting, and actually took apart, opened up a North Face bag where their fill area was. And that's where Blue Puma started doing that. We started doing that at Blue Puma. The way I filled was totally different after that. The other part of it was, as retailers for North Face and Sierra Designs, different things, I was able to go down and get tours of their factories. And up at our place, when Don and Rick were doing Blue Puma, they were sewing. They had no experience with industrial machines, and they were pushing this stuff through the machine. And when I went down, I was looking at North Face and Sierra Designs. Their seamstresses weren't working nearly as hard at it. And
physically.
And so I learned stuff there. And then as I started learning about the sewing machines, I realized that Don and Rick had their sewing machines totally adjusted wrong, where they really did have to pull the fabric through it. And so I'm a perfectionist, and I really started learning really how those machines ought to be adjusted and how it would go. And again,
Chuck has an engineering background so
anyways,
kind of his world.
So that, so yeah, we were picking up stuff like that. I didn't want, when we went to DownHome, I really didn't be copying everything. Our bags were totally unique. And that's where, again, with Fred, I went up to Early Winters at that time, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was up in Seattle. And they had grown really fast, and they'd grown too fast and went bankrupt ultimately, but they made a really big splash in the late 70s. And it was up there, and we went in, and their vice president, who was their designer, we were with him and with the president of the company, and the designer was going, "Oh, your sleeping bags are so incredible," and he started raving about our sleeping bags. And well, the president said, "Well, we make good stuff too." And he says, "You can't make stuff like yours." And I said, "And make money?" And he goes, "You said that, not me." And that was the case for Denice and I. We were making the most expensive sleeping bags in the world. And at our peak, we were making lower than minimum wage doing it. There was an incredible amount of labor into making these bags the way we did. And so no other, as far as I know, nobody else ever, when we dropped it, nobody else ever took that up at that level. I got to where living out here wasn't backpacking so much because I was living in the mountains anymore. And, but I went into REI and was looking at stuff, and somebody was doing trapezoidal baffling.
Somebody
and I
picked it up.
don't know whether anybody does that anywhere or not, but as far as an original contribution to sleeping bag design that actually went, ironically, it's the idea of trapezoidal baffling. Anyway, I'm gabbing a lot here.
No, that's great. That's why we're doing this. Why did you keep doing it? I know you kind of mentioned, I mean, you made money doing it, minimum wage, but why did you both keep doing it?
Well,
it was work we could do out here in the country.
It gave you some flexibility.
I mean, it's more the story.
Yeah.
And that was because the goal was to become a farmer. And I was interested in draft horses, and I got draft horses and started, actually, because we're out in the mountains, I started doing horse logging. So that, that was, we wanted to do that more than the bags. The bags was just to be a cash crop type of thing. And the idea also there with moving out, all we needed was UPS and a telephone to do this. I would spend, and being a kind of motor mouth guy, people would call rather their design, bags. And sometimes I'd spend a couple hours or more, just talking with them. And then because there was a long wait time on our bags, then we'd have extended phone conversations. They were paying the bill, fortunately, for the long distance, but over, months. I mean, it gotten at the end, it was a 1-year waiting list on our bags. So you had to wait about a year to get your bag. But along the way, I got really depressed by the fact that most of the people who bought our bags didn't really need them. And I'm concerned about consumer stuff. And we were making something that nobody really needed. It was just, it was for, we had a few serious climbers, mountaineers that bought the stuff. I had a guy that was climbing up in Mount McKinley and stuff. And, he actually wore out part of the bag just because he was spending like 200 nights a year, in his sleeping bag. There was a guy who was an archaeologist who he did it was underwater archaeology in the Andes, high elevation, the Andes, and called us afterwards and said, he had a floating hood bag. He said, I need another hood for my bag. And he said, well, I was up there and the wind caught it and it blew it over this ledge. And he lost the bag. The hood. Another lady went to Papua New Guinea, I guess. And I forget whether it was we made some jackets and we made mukluks. Anyway, I forget what it was exactly, the piece that she had, but she'd gone to New Guinea and was back in where the natives had really and had never had contact with the Western culture, and she ended up trading something from us for a stone axe with somebody there. But the depressing part of it was another guy called and says, "This is so beautiful. I don't want to use it. I just want to hang it over the mantle in the living room." And another guy was an engineer in Los Angeles. He was from Hong Kong. And he bought a bag, and then he bought another bag, and he wasn't getting out. He bought another bag. He bought 3 bags, and he wasn't using them because he couldn't take time off. And he went to buy another bag. And I said, "Look, I'm not going to sell you another bag until you go out and start using this stuff."
That's so funny because that's
used. I didn't want it just to be a total toy.
Right.
And then ultimately I went into a severe depression around environmental issues and stuff, into the deep. I won't get into it, but it was extremely deep. And Denise said, "Well, maybe we don't need that. Perhaps we should consider having a kid or something." And
no, I didn't bring up the kid thing. You brought up the kid thing, and I wasn't interested. And I said, "Well, we could always adopt."
She says, "Well, the world may not need more kids, but they may need more parents." And so we started adopting. And then ultimately we ended up adopting 7. We weren't getting sleeping bags done. And finally we decided that we needed to face the fact that we weren't really doing it. And we shut down.
Just focused on the kids.
Yeah. What year was that?
We shut down in 94.
Okay.
And we still get
our first kids were adopted in 91.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have one guy back in North Carolina that I don't know, 10 years later something called and wondered if we could make a bag for him. Well, we don't. I mean, the stuff is actually buried under a bunch of kids' stuff in there and stuff. And he's really wanting to do it. And then more recently, it was just a couple of years ago, he called again.
Are you sure?
He said, "Well, I gave my bag to my son, and I really need a bag."
Well, is that something that you've noticed? I mean, I feel like your company is so unique because like you said, there's this waiting list for product. You're on the phone with these people. I imagine you built some kind of attachment, maybe at least on their end, they developed an attachment to you and to the company and to the product.
There's an emotional attachment for me too. I mean, it's
design, all that design work.
But it has to be part of our past, I guess. But around those waiting lists and stuff, Peter Limmer made customs boots back in, and again, you ordered. It was a 1-year waiting list to get boots from him. And I actually went back. I was traveling around the United States, and I actually went to his place where he could measure my feet and stuff. And then a year later, I got my boots. And
wow.
If you've never connected that with your interviews and stuff, his boots, the entire upper of the boot is made out of one piece of leather, which is incredibly difficult to do. I mean, they're amazing. Nowadays, that type of boot isn't really popular anymore. But again, with those boots, back to Arcata Transit, one of the frustrations, mountaineering boots at Humboldt State became kind of a craze. Everybody wanted, and so these people, I don't think many of them ever went out hiking at all. We're buying these mountaineering boots from us just to wear around campus. And you buy all kinds of things, and you could see it as it developed out where the money was in clothing. Mm-hmm. It was some of this other, the hard equipment wasn't what kept businesses going, shops going. And that was really frustrating and depressing for me. I've struggled with depression over the years, but that was the whole business thing. It's just excess consumption,
right?
Which I'm still really opposed to. I think it's part of what's really putting our Earth in such great crisis.
Right. Well, there's definitely, I mean, that's something that I see when I go to large trade shows, or used to go to large trade shows. We don't do that much now. But you see a lot of product that you could take the label off and you wouldn't know whose it is, right? A lot of it kind of all looks the same. And to your point, the most sustainable thing would be to have fewer products, right? Not as much stuff floating out there in the world.
That also, again, with when we finally did it, and I wanted to do kind of a classy catalog, and that was that, but it was all in black and white. It was sort of an attempt at art in a ways. So I was really proud of this catalog. And so we mailed a copy of this to Dave and Elaine Meeks, who wasn't making the stuff anymore, but it was somebody I really respected. Elaine sent us a postcard back and said, well, Dave says, sure, a long ways from a sleeping bag pinned together. Long ways from two blankets pinned together, which predated sleeping bags essentially.
Yeah.
From Dave, that wasn't a compliment. Again, it was just we're getting carried away with this stuff. Again, this idea people don't need it.
Right.
Our bags are beautiful things, but most people didn't need them.
Right. I think the story that you shared about the 1 year waiting list is really interesting, because the time that we live in now, I need everything in 2 days. I need that 2-day shipping from Amazon. And that, I think, leads to a lot of impulse purchases, right? It's like, oh, well, I can order that and get it now. But I imagine thinking about buying products, knowing that I would get it in a year, that would definitely change what I buy. And I just think that's an interesting idea, right? From a different time. And I think maybe that's something that we can adopt more of, right? It's okay. Do I still want to buy this thing if I'm going to get it in a year, right? That's when okay, that's a thing I'm really going to value. I'm really going to appreciate. I want to make sure that it's quality. It's going to last a long time. It's worth the wait. Now, in the business world now, that's probably not feasible to say, hey, wait a year, we'll get you a product. But I think that idea is really interesting, right? That mentality of, okay, I can wait, right? I don't need this stuff.
We tried to take care of people's needs. And that's, if somebody had a really important outing or expedition or something like that coming up, I suppose that was one reason some other people had to wait a year. is that if there was, if it was really important that somebody would get a bag, we'd make it. But even then, at the shortest, it'd be several weeks.
Right. Still, even having to wait a few weeks.
It took us a couple of days to make each bag.
Right. Yeah.
The sales rep came by, and at one point he said, how long do you think it takes Coleman to make a sleeping bag? And I said, well, I don't know, about an hour or something. He said, 15 minutes.
Wow.
15 minutes from receiving the materials cut till they get shipped out. 15 minutes. Which, obviously those weren't backpacking sleeping bags or anything, and I figured, well, geez, there's at least 8 hours of labor into one of our bags. So anyway.
So over the course of the time the company was around, you were making products. How many do you think you two made? Did you have employees? Was it just you two that was making everything?
It was just the two of us. Ultimately we made more mucklucks and stuff, because I designed a muckluck that wouldn't slip off your foot. I mean, which you actually could go out and run in our mucklucks and whatever. Anyway, as far as the bags,
how many? We kept track of it, but
it was just a few hundred. total, a couple, 200 or 300 bags,
Right.
maybe 300 bags.
What were some of the other products? You mentioned mucklucks. I read something about a shelter, Misty Mountain shelter.
Yeah. There was, again, I think early winter, when Gore-Tex fabric became developed, early winters made a one-piece shelter, sort of. But I saw that there's real problems with it. And so at Blue Puma, I designed a shelter, a one-person shelter that zipped up, was totally sealed, but it was open. It had a mosquito netting in it, where it could really function as a one-person tent, and we called it the Bare Necessity, but BEAR. Anyway, and then I sold out, and I thought, geez, that's my design, and
now what do we do?
And so again, I refined it a lot more, and we started selling that as the Misty Mountain shelter, and we actually did start making those. We did sell those before we brought the sleeping bags out.
Oh,
so we had the Misty Mountain shelter, and then we had down booties and down mucklucks, and the muckluck went up to where again, you could wear it in deep snow. It didn't come off. Anyway, so we had the mucklucks and we had the booties, and that was it.
What was it about this time? We interviewed a few people involved in the creation of Rivendell Mountain Works.
Yeah.
What was going on with the Lord of the Rings influence? Misty Mountain Shelter, Rivendell Mountain Works.
Oh God!
What was going on around that time?
Misty Mountain didn't come from that. It was here in Deadwood. We get about 100 inches of rain a year.
Okay.
There's a lot of Misty.
So the real world
in Arcata also. That's right. Arcata. This was in Arcata, which
Arcata had the Misty Mountain.
Is total.
Okay.
In Arcata, 70 degrees was a heat wave.
Right.
Kind of,
okay.
And so, yeah, the name actually did come from there. With our sleeping bags, naming them, we wanted to come up with names that nobody else used. And so I was into bird watching and stuff. So we started naming after birds, and we tried to pick a bird that would be found in the type of habitat or whatever that the bags would be made for. And so we had the dipper and the hummingbird and the snow bunting.
The ptarmigan.
Ptarmigan was the thickest one. They were not real macho mountaineering names.
There's the hummingbird right there.
Yeah. But then we made a more simplified bag, and we wanted it to be another thing. And so we named it after mountains. We had the Cascades and stuff like that. And so then that one didn't have the double zipper.
Two hummingbirds chasing each other.
and then we made, so then we got into a semi-rectangular bag with fancier stuff where the shoulder could be closed with snaps, and then
together.
But if it was zipped together, it actually could close down between the people to where it was like a mummy bag. So the openings for those bags. So we end up making those into a flower series. And so we had a bag named the Fawn Lily, Columbine, Larkspur, Trillium.
Yeah. The flowers around here.
And then for really ultralight, it was made as a liner potentially for the heavier bags, but by itself, I bicycled across the United States in 71 and went with just 15 pounds of gear on the bike, and I thought it was about having a really light bag for something like that. So we made a bag, the lightest bag at that time in the world. And we named that the Zephyr. Yeah, so those are the names came up. The Zephyr, as far as this is being edited, so you can edit out of stuff, make it shorter. But where did ultralight come from? It kind of came from Fred Williams and I. Sort of. I wrote an article for. Well, we made the Zephyr, which is light. I wrote I guess it became an opinion article for Backpacker magazine, which was about ultralight, spirit of ultralight, and except my consumption stuff. I said the spirit of ultralight is not going out and buying all this fancy ultralight stuff. It's substituting equipment with imagination, figuring out how you could do it without something. And years ago in the Sierras, I came across two guys. They're out backpacking, never backpacked before, and they just had their stuff. They had some old sleeping bags they'd stuck in, and they bought some balloon bread from the store, and they just kind of went out and did this. And I said, that was more the spirit of ultralight than it was just taking what you had and going out. Well, anyway, with the light, I challenged Fred to an ultralight challenge, and which was to go out. The requirement was we go out it had to be 5 days, doing 25 miles a day, and we couldn't take anything more than 15 pounds, measuring everything from the skin out. Literally all of our equipment had to be under 15 pounds cumulative, including the food and everything. And we went out and we did this thing, and we went the Three Sisters Wilderness here in the Cascades. And when we were finished with the 5 days, we had about 5 pounds of food left. We realized we could have probably done this at 10 pounds total. And we did, the climbing, we climbed the North Sister as part of this. And the idea was to do an article also for Backpacker. They had said we'd be interested. But Fred knew, and again, I forget names, but this guy at Outside magazine that did stuff. And Fred told him about it, and he wrote it up in Outside. And so Backpacker canceled my article. But that was in 1981, I guess, perhaps. And it was really before people were making the quote ultralight equipment. Anyway, so some of those things, they came out of just crazy things. So.
Well, I had to ask a little bit about the names, and I'm glad you shared some of the different names of different products. But yeah, the Misty Mountain one caught my attention because we did an interview all about Rivendell Mountain Works.
Yeah.
And Larry Horton, and and maybe this is kind of a good way to tie everything together, but and maybe you share some of these same thoughts, but a lot of that was kind of a reaction to what was happening in the world at the moment, and this escape, right? Going to the Tetons, right? Going to your own version of, kind of an alternate world and starting a gear company. Rivendell, building your own world a little bit. And so that's why I asked about that name in particular. But do you kind of share some of those same feelings around, I mean, you kind of mentioned, right? It's like building a company so you could escape, so you could go to your own paradise, right? Is there some truth to that from your perspective?
Yeah. John Muir is kind of one of my heroes. And is long before I got into that type of thing, before I knew who John Muir was. By the way, my high school was named John Muir High School in Pasadena. But anyway, I was reading some of his stuff, and one of the anecdotes in his writing was about, he'd did this 1,000-mile walk around the United States and stuff, but then he went by ship to San Francisco. And he landed in San Francisco, and the first thing he did was go up to somebody and said, "How do you get out of town?" And they told him how to get out, and then that's where he ended up walking to Yosemite. But he wrote that as a kid in Wisconsin, on his farm, they were digging a well. And because he was the youngest, he could fit down in the well. And so he was down in the well digging, and then they'd haul it out with buckets. When he's down there, he got what they called well gas, I think at that time, but I think it was methane or something that was building up in the thing. And as he was down there, he was gradually become overcome by this gas. And it was just slowing down. And he, in one of his writings, characterized people living in the city as that way, that the longer they were in the city, the less they were wanting to get out or whatever. It's kind of like getting drugged. That importance of being out and reconnecting with the earth, I think that's really important. I think it's one of the most important reason for backpacking. For me now, I mean, one of the things I don't backpack is the concern for how much driving there was to, drive 150 miles to go on a 10-mile hike or something like that. When we had the river touring stuff, it took 150 miles of driving out and back to do this 20-mile river float. And that, again, for me was kind of insupportable. And it's a conflict. I think it's really important that people get out to the wilderness, get out to nature. But that is, the conflict with that is all the consumption that's required to do the
Right.
driving, the gasoline, that type of thing. So we're blessed to be able to live where we do that way. The flip side of it is that we're 50 miles from town. We were doing, I think, 6,000 miles about a year of driving.
Wow.
With the adoption stuff. At the peak of that, one year we did 60,000 miles of driving. And for me, it was literally praying to God that, that somehow these kids' needs were such that we had to sacrifice that. Well, the need for getting out to the wilderness is sort of like that. It's this trade-off between, most of the people that are doing this outdoor stuff are, quote, environmentalists also. If they're really serious about their environmental concerns, there is this conflict that has to be traded off.
Right.
I don't have the answer to it.
But I think I think that idea needs to be challenged. I'm glad you're bringing it up because, yeah, there is the conflict there. And I don't know if we'll solve it here. If we solve it here, that's going to be amazing. But I'm glad that you bring it up. It's something that needs to be talked about even more. And more than that, I think people need to step up and do something about it. And, that's something that I've always liked about where our university is located. We're 5 minutes from a canyon, 5 minutes from, a beautiful river with great fishing, great climbing, great hiking. I can really get anywhere in town on my bike. I should do that more. But I love that idea of being somewhere where it's a walkable, bikeable community where you're close to outdoor recreation opportunities and you're not in that conflict. So I'm glad that you bring that up.
What is your town?
We're in Logan, Utah. So it's northern Utah. It's a little college town. About an hour and a half north of Salt Lake City. So, well, I think that's a really great place to kind of tie some of this together. Did we miss anything? What else do you want to share and leave with everybody? I don't want to miss anything, but
over in the environmental pitch, because that still is a real and it ties together, I guess, with our faith. But Pope Francis wrote an encyclical Laudato Si, and one of the phrases out of that I think is really important is, hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. That social justice and environmental justice are linked. They can't be separated. And then the emphasis is we're at well, with the backpacking also, our kids and grandkids aren't going to be able to experience the earth like we do. For me, backpacking in the 60s and the 70s, you could go out and hike and not see anybody for a couple of days, possibly. Today, in like the Three Sisters, you have to make a reservation for campsites in the backcountry. It's just what I got to experience as a young person isn't available to people today. What we can experience today isn't going to be possible for people 50 years from now. And to a much, much more serious extent, and really, if we don't come to grips with the extreme crises now, God knows what is going to happen to the next generation. I think life is going to be really, really hard for them. And this stuff about what kind of backpacking gear you need and this type of stuff is going to become irrelevant for lots of people. It's not even going to be an option for a lot of people, and it's real sad.
Right. No, I'm glad that you shared that. Denise, any thoughts?
We're surrounded by hummingbirds here.
We're surrounded by hummingbirds this morning. No, I don't really have anything else to say. No, but this has been a wonderful opportunity. Yes.
Thanks for being willing.
Hear the story again, and
it's
been kind of fun.
As you've noticed, I'm the motor mouth she's the worker bee, and I'm the motor mouth.
Complimentary.
Dreamer.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking time to share the story. I really appreciate it. And I can only imagine what it's like to get a random phone call from someone and asking about your life. So I appreciate you answering the phone and not hanging up.
It was a surprise.
Yeah, I was starting to think ancient history. Okay, what was all that about?
Yeah. Well, it's been fun for me to learn. I'm kind of a student of the industry, and not a student of this program, but I want to learn about this industry and be a part of it and take the lessons that, I think it's important to hear your perspective, right? You've been in this industry and been a part of it, and you've learned some really valuable lessons that I think are especially relevant today. Those are important stories to be told. So just want to do the little bit that I can to help share those stories and learn from myself. Some of this is kind of a selfish endeavor as well, but this is fun for me. But I appreciate you taking some time. So thanks again.
Thank you, Jace.